We need to talk about the structural Constitution. That's right, the structural Constitution and how it protects our Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms. The structural Constitution is something I've been meaning to talk to you about, and I've decided the best way to teach you this critical concept is from listening to Justice Scalia talk about this issue to Congress itself. The structural Constitution is one of the best ways we preserve our freedoms, including the right to keep and bear arms. Let's talk all about this. You're not going to want to miss this because Justice Scalia is a brilliant man, and this video is spectacular. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of many Second Amendment related books, including Disarmed, What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, so I'm going to cut to the chase. I've been wanting to talk about the structural Constitution, which is really the notion of the structure of the Constitution is what protects Americans' freedoms more than anything else, including, yes, indeed, the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms. You see, the structural Constitution, which I'm going to have Justice Scalia explain to you in great detail in a very fascinating way, is really about the structure of the Constitution itself. Things like the separation of powers, where we have the executive branch, which sometimes fights with the legislative branch. We have a bicameral legislature, where the United States Senate sometimes fights with the U.S. House of Representatives. And of course, they all fight with the courts sometimes when legislation is struck down. Of course, there's a whole separate issue here about the dangers of the regulatory state, the administrative state, or the deep state, whatever you want to call these unelected bureaucrats, and whether or not they have too much power. They certainly do, but that's not the purpose of this particular video. We're going to talk about the structural Constitution. That includes also things like federalism, where you have states such as Florida fighting the federal government, such as the Biden administration, over things like border security and many other issues. You also have the notion of checks and balances, where every branch sort of counterbalances and checks another branch, especially when they're fighting. And of course, the Supreme Court can declare certain things to be unconstitutional and unenforceable under the doctrine of judicial review. So there's a lot of things to this structural Constitution notion, and you'll see when Justice Scalia explains it that the Bill of Rights is not always the most important thing to protecting our freedom. Keep in mind that Justice Scalia was a member of his high school rifle team. He was a great proponent and supporter of the text of the Second Amendment. He is the author, of course, of the famous decision, the District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, a big proponent of the right to keep and bear arms. In fact, unfortunately, when he passed away, he was actually on a hunting trip in Texas. So with that said, let's turn to the videotape of Justice Scalia explaining why the structural Constitution, what it is, and why it's so important to preserving our freedoms. It's very important that you understand these concepts to make sure we don't lose the United States.
I asked them, what do you think is the reason that America is such a free country? What is it in our Constitution that makes us what we are? And I guarantee you that the response I will get, and you will get this from almost any American, including the woman that he was talking to at the supermarket, the answer would be freedom of speech, freedom of the press, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no quartering of troops in hope, those marvelous provisions of the Bill of Rights. But then I tell them, if you think that a Bill of Rights is what sets us apart, you're crazy. Every banana republic in the world has a Bill of Rights. Every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. I mean it literally. It was much better. We guarantee freedom of speech and of the press. Big deal. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. Whoa, that is wonderful stuff. Of course, just words on paper. What our framers would have called a parchment guarantee. And the reason is that the real constitution of the Soviet Union, you think of the word constitution, it doesn't mean a bill, it means structure. Say a person has a sound constitution, has a sound structure. The real constitution of the Soviet Union, which is what our framers debated that whole summer in Philadelphia in 1787. They didn't talk about the Bill of Rights. That was an afterthought, wasn't it? That Constitution of the Soviet Union did not prevent the centralization of power in one person or in one party. And when that happens, the game is over. The Bill of Rights is just what our framers would call a parchment guarantee. So, the real key to the distinctiveness of America is the structure of our government. One part of it, of course, is the independence of the judiciary. But there's a lot more. There are very few countries in the world, for example, that have a bicameral legislature. Oh, England has a House of Lords for the time being, but the House of Lords has no substantial power. They can just make the Commons pass a bill a second time. France has a Senate, it's honorific. Italy has a Senate, it's honorific. Very few countries have two separate bodies in the legislature equally powerful. That's a lot of trouble, as you gentlemen doubtless know, to get the same language through two different bodies elected in a different fashion. Very few countries in the world have a separately elected chief executive. Sometimes I go to Europe to talk about separation of powers. And when I get there, I find that all I'm talking about is independence of the judiciary. Because the Europeans don't even try to divide the two political powers, the two political branches, the legislature and the chief executive. In all of the parliamentary countries, the chief executive is the creature of the legislature. There's never any disagreement between them and the prime minister, as there is sometimes between you and the president. When there's a disagreement, they just kick them out. They have a no confidence vote, a new election, and they get a prime minister who agrees with the legislature. And, you know, the Europeans look at this system and they say, well, it passes one house, it doesn't pass the other house. Sometimes the other house is in the control of a different party. It passes both, and then this president who has a veto power vetoes it, and they look at this and they say, it is gridlock. And I hear Americans saying this nowadays, and there's a lot of it going around. They talk about a dysfunctional government because there's disagreement, and the framers would have said, yes, that's exactly the way we set it up. We wanted this to be power, contradicting power, because the main ill that beset us, as Hamilton said in the Federalist, when he talked about a separate Senate. He said, yes, it seems inconvenient, but inasmuch as the main ill that besets us is an excess of legislation, it won't be so bad. This is 1787. He didn't know what an excess of legislation was. So unless Americans can appreciate that and learn to love the separation of powers, which means learning to love the gridlock, which the framers believed would be the main protection of minorities. The main protection. If a bill is about to pass that really comes down hard on some minority, they think it's terribly unfair. It doesn't take much to throw a monkey wrench into this complex system. So Americans should appreciate that, and they should learn to love the gridlock. It's there for a reason, so that the legislation that gets out will be good legislation. And thus conclude my opening remarks.
All right, folks, well, I hope you learned a little bit something about this concept of the structural Constitution. It's just as important to our Second Amendment rights as the Bill of Rights itself. And, of course, the fact that we have guns privately also serves, I think, as another sort of check on tyrannical governments here in the United States. But for the purposes of all these different checks and balances, it's not just an armed citizenry that serves as a check and balance. Of course, it's these other constitutional structures in place that also help protect us against a rapacious and overreaching and potentially tyrannical government at all levels. So important to know the structural Constitution and how it works, and Justice Scalia did a great job explaining it. So I hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Make sure you subscribe and resubscribe. We're having issues getting to 150,000 subscribers, but we're working hard to get there. Don't forget to follow me on X, where I have more Second Amendment news at Four Boxes Diner. And we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.